The ice came first, as a whisper against the window glass, so soft that she almost mistook it for snow. Then the whisper turned to ticking, then to a hiss, then to a low roar that pressed against the walls of every house in Larkspur Hollow, like a fist closing slowly around the valley. By midnight of that first night in December of 1887, the temperature had dropped so fast that the well pump in the town square seized solid, its iron handle sheathed in a clear, merciless glaze. In the frame houses along Main Street, families piled quilts 3 deep and fed their stoves until the woodpiles shrank to nothing. Barns groaned under the weight of ice-laden roofs. Somewhere past midnight, a fence line a rancher had spent 2 summers building came down all at once, rails snapping like dry bones under a coat of glass an inch thick. The wind did not blow so much as press, steady and endless, carrying a cold that seemed to come up out of the ground itself rather than down from the sky. And yet on the south-facing bluff above the creek, where the land folded itself into a low shoulder of stone and clay, a single window glowed amber and did not flicker. The dugout carved into that bluff had been a joke in Larkspur Hollow since the spring it was built. A home half in the earth, its roof a low mound of sod and packed clay, its door set into rock like the entrance to a den. Neighbors had called it a badger hole more than once, laughing behind gloved hands at the notion that any decent family would choose to live beneath the ground like a root vegetable. The woman who kept house there had heard the word badger enough times that she no longer flinched at it. The man who had dug it, board by board and barrow by barrow, only smiled and kept working, as though he alone understood something about the shape of the land that the rest of the valley had never bothered to ask him. Now, while ice sealed every door in town shut and cracked window glass in a dozen houses, the dugout's thick earthen walls held their heat the way a stone holds the warmth of a long afternoon sun. Inside, a small fire burned low and steady, in no hurry, needing far less wood than it should have. Outside, the storm did not so much attack the bluff as slide over it, deflected by the very slope the town had always found ridiculous. By morning, no smoke rose from half the chimneys in Larkspur Hollow. The valley had gone dark and silent under a skin of ice, thick enough to catch the gray daylight and throw it back like a mirror. Somewhere beneath that mirror, in a house nobody had ever respected, 2 people sat warm by their fire, listening to the wind search for a way in that it would not find, not on this first night, and, though neither of them yet understood it, not for 7 more nights to come. 3 years before that first night of wind and ice, the bluff had been nothing but a scar of shale and stubborn grass at the edge of the claim office's least wanted parcel. The land agent had practically given it away, apologizing as he stamped the paper, as though he were selling them a sack of rocks instead of 160 acres. Most of the good bottomland along the creek had already gone to families with wagons full of milled lumber and iron stove parts, families who had arrived a season earlier and staked their claims where the soil ran black and deep. What remained was the bluff, steep, south-facing, littered with sandstone that broke plows and hearts in equal measure. She had walked the ridge first, her boots sliding on loose scree, while he stood below with the team and watched her the way a man watches weather he cannot yet read. When she came back down she was smiling, and she told him the slope faced the sun nearly all day, that the rock beneath the topsoil ran solid enough to hold a roof, that the hill itself would do half their work if they only let it. He had trusted her instinct before he understood her reasoning, the way he always did, and so they staked the claim while their nearest neighbors still shook their heads over supper tables, certain the young couple had been swindled out of good land. Word traveled fast in a valley. with little else to talk about. By the second week, men leaned on the fence posts of the general store and speculated aloud about frame houses and proper foundations, about families who built into the earth like animals denning for winter. A few called it foolishness to their faces, gently, the way neighbors do when they mean to be kind and still manage to wound. Others were not so gentle, and one blacksmith's wife had laughed outright at the church social, saying she'd sooner freeze standing up than live like a badger in the ground. Naomi had only nodded, polite and unbothered, while Elias measured the hillside with a length of rope and a straight stick, checking the angle of the slope against the path the sun traveled each day, muttering figures under his breath that meant nothing to anyone but him. He had learned the trick of it from a Shoshone family who had wintered 2 seasons past near the river bend, watching how they banked earth high against stone walls, how their lodges stayed warm on nights when frame cabins groaned and split from the cold. Nobody in town had thought to ask them anything at all. So through that first summer, while their neighbors framed walls and shingled roofs against the coming winter, Elias and Naomi began instead to dig, patient, deliberate, ignoring the laughter drifting up from town like smoke on a still evening, certain of a truth the valley had not yet learned to see. The wind that morning carried the smell of river mud and wood smoke, and years later she would still remember it exactly that way, sharp and cold against her face as she walked down toward the bend where the Shoshone family had made their winter camp 2 seasons before ever a shovel touched the bluff. It had started plainly enough, her husband trading a mended axe head for a length of sinew rope, a morning's labor splitting rails in exchange for dried meat, and a lesson in reading weather from the shape of clouds banked against the mountains. The trading had gone on quietly all that first autumn, neither side making much of it, the way honest work between neighbors rarely needs announcing. It was the old man of that family, patient and unhurried in his speech, who first let her husband watch as they packed earth high against the stone face behind their lodge, tamping it firm with the flat of a paddle, layering grass and bark between courses like a mason laying brick. He asked questions the way a careful man does, one at a time, waiting long between them, and the old man answered without hurry, showing him how the stone drew warmth from a low fire and held it long after the flame had gone to embers, how the earth banked against it kept that warmth from bleeding out into the night wind. She had come along more than once with her ledger tucked under her arm, the same book she used for counting seed and flour, and had taken to writing down what her husband could not yet put into figures: the depth of the banked earth measured in handspans, the angle of the south-facing slope, the number of days a single fire needed feeding compared to the wood piles their neighbors burned through in a week. She was no artist, but she sketched what she saw well enough to remember it later. The doorway set low and turned from the wind, the smoke hole angled just so, the walls thick enough that even the coldest nights left only a gentle chill inside rather than a bone-deep ache. The family moved on before the first snow, following the herds toward country they knew better than any map a surveyor might draw, and there had been no promise of return, no word left behind but a nod of the head and a small bundle of dried roots pressed into her hands. She had thanked them plainly, feeling the weight of something larger than gratitude, though she could not have named it then. Only later, thumbing through the pages of that ledger by lamplight while her husband recalculated his angles for the 10th time, did she understand they had been given something the whole valley would one day need and refuse to ask for themselves, a truth pressed into the earth, long before any fence post or frame wall claimed to master it. By the second morning of the storm, the valley had gone silent in a way that frightened more than any wind could. Ice had crept into every well by dawn, sealing the water beneath a hand's thickness of gray glass, so that even the sturdiest pump handles broke off in men's fists when they tried to force them. She heard the news from a boy who came stumbling down the drifted path, his eyelashes crusted white, gasping that the Faraday barn roof had folded under the weight of ice sometime before light, the whole ridge beam giving way at once with a sound like a rifle crack, burying 2 milk cows and scattering the rest of the herd bawling into the storm. Word spread through Larkspur Hollow the way fire spreads through dry grass, urgent and unstoppable, though there was precious little warmth in it. Families who had laughed at the sight of a house dug into a hillside were now the same families dragging half-frozen livestock toward barns with cracked timbers, praying the walls would hold one more night. Fence rails vanished into cook stoves and hearths, sacrificed for an hour's heat that would not outlast the dark. Somewhere across the ridge, a church bell rang without a hand near the rope, ice loosened and clanging on its own in the wind, and more than one soul took it for an omen. Inside the dugout, the couple moved with a steadiness that mirrored the earth around them. He banked the coals low and even before first light, checking the angle of the smoke hole, though he had checked it a dozen times already, murmuring measurements to himself, the way another man might murmur a prayer. She wrapped herself in her shawl and ducked through the low doorway into the passage that led to the root cellar, her breath barely fogging in air that stayed gentle even as the wind screamed above. The potatoes lay undisturbed in their straw, the jarred beans unclouded, the strings of dried apples swaying only slightly from the draft of her passing. Nothing had frozen. Nothing had cracked. She ran her palm along the earthen wall, cool and dry, and thought of the ledger tucked beside their bed, the sketches of a doorway turned just so against the wind. When she returned, he was mending a harness by the fire's low light, unhurried, his hands steady despite the wind's fury pressing against the bluff outside. Neither spoke of the barn roof or the frozen wells, though both had heard the boy's shaking voice carry the news across the yard. There was work enough in tending what they had, feeding the fire its modest portion, checking the goats settled warm in their sheltered pen, marking the level of grain against the wall in pencil. Outside, the ice thickened on every fence post and window frame in town, sealing doors shut, silvering the world into something brittle and strange. And though neither of them said it aloud, both understood that before the week's end, more than potatoes and dried apples would be asked of the ground beneath their feet. The wind found every seam of the shutters and worried at them like a hand testing a latch, but inside, the fire held its steady breath, and she let her mind drift backward to the autumn that had built this shelter, the autumn the whole hollow had watched with open scorn. It had begun with a wagon of creekstone hauled up from the shallows below the bluff, load after load, until her shoulders ached with the rhythm of lifting. He had walked the slope for a week before that, studying the way the rock face caught morning sun and held it, marking with a stick where the ground stayed driest after rain. She remembered asking him once, half in jest, whether he meant to live like a badger, and he had only smiled and said the badger had the right idea long before any man built a house of boards and called it wisdom. They dug through September into October, the earth giving way in stubborn clay clumps that dulled every blade they owned. He packed the walls the way he'd watched a Shoshone family do it 2 winters before, tamping the soil in thin layers against the fitted stone, each course pressed firm before the next was laid, so that the wall breathed like living rock rather than crumbling like a ditch bank. Neighbors passing on the road slowed their wagons to stare, and more than one called out that they were building a grave for themselves, that no Christian family ought to burrow into a hillside like vermin. She had stood at the doorway one afternoon, dirt to her elbows, and told a passing farmer's wife that the ground kept its warmth better than any board wall ever built, that this was no shame but a kind of listening to what the land already knew. The woman had laughed, not unkindly, but with the sureness of someone who believed frame and shingle were the only decent shelter a soul could claim. The name stuck after that, the Badger Hole, spoken in the mercantile, murmured after church, repeated by children who did not understand what they mocked. Through it all he had kept building, unhurried, testing each doorway's angle against the prevailing wind, until he found the turn that broke its force before it ever reached the hearth. She had sewn burlap linings for the walls near the sleeping loft, packed straw where the earth met timber joints, and marked, in a ledger she kept hidden from prying eyes, every measurement that seemed to matter: the pitch of the roof beam, the depth of the south-facing cut, the exact place where the chimney drew clean instead of choking with smoke. By the time the first snow came, the dugout stood finished, ridiculed and warm, and she had told him, quiet and certain, that one day the valley would ask what they knew instead of laughing at how they lived. Now, with the wind screaming against the bluff and the fire burning low and faithful, she wondered how much longer that day would wait. The knock came just past midday, though the sky had gone so dark with ice fog that it might have been dusk. She heard it first over the wind, 3 heavy strikes, then a pause, then a 4th strike weaker than the rest, as if the hand behind it had lost its strength between blows. He was at the door before she could set down the kettle. When he pulled it open, the wind shoved a wall of frozen air into the room, and with it came the blacksmith, his wife, and the 2 young ones bundled so thick in quilts they looked like sacks of grain someone had dragged through the drifts. The blacksmith's beard was crusted white to the jaw. His wife's lips had gone the color of a bruised plum, and she could not stop shaking long enough to speak. "Chimney came down," the blacksmith managed, his voice scraped thin. "Whole flue split in the cold. Smoke had nowhere to go but back into the house. We near choked before we saw it and put out the fire ourselves. Been walking since I don't rightly know how long." She did not ask how they had found the dugout or why they had chosen the Badger Hole over any of the frame houses closer to town. There was no time for such questions, not with the woman's fingers so stiff she could not work the buttons of her own coat. Naomi took the smaller child from her arms without a word, peeling back frozen wool to check the little face beneath, relieved to find it pinched with cold but breathing steady. Elias was already banking the fire higher, feeding in the seasoned oak they had split back in September, when the woodpile still felt like an excess rather than a lifeline. He guided the blacksmith to the bench nearest the hearth, wrapped his own coat around the man's shoulders though it left him in his shirt sleeves, and said nothing about the years of silence between their families, the years the blacksmith had shod every horse in the valley, but never once offered a kind word about the dugout. Naomi set the older child near the fire and began working the woman's boots loose, her fingers moving fast and sure over laces gone rigid with ice. "You're safe now," she said, though she could not be certain of it herself, with the wind still shrieking against the bluff, like something alive and starving. Warm first, words after. The blacksmith's wife looked around at the low earthen ceiling, the burlap-lined walls, the chimney drawing clean and steady despite the storm raging over the whole of Larkspur Hollow, and something in her expression cracked open. Not quite shame, not quite wonder, but close kin to both. Naomi caught Elias's eye across the room, over the heads of the shivering family they had pulled from the ice. Neither of them spoke the thought aloud, but it passed between them plain as daylight. The valley had begun asking, at last, though it had taken near freezing to death to make the question come. The memory came to her then, unbidden, the way memories will when the present grows too heavy to hold alone. 3 winters passed, their first in the dugout, when the valley had watched them carve a home into the bluff face and called it foolishness, dressed up as thrift. That December had brought its own cold, not the murderous ice of this one, but cold enough to crack the mortar on newly raised chimneys and freeze the water barrels solid by the second week. She remembered standing at the mouth of their unfinished dugout, watching smoke rise thin and steady from their own small chimney, while, across the frozen creek, the Hendricks place burned through cordwood at a rate that would not see them to February. He had worked that whole first autumn packing earth against the stone at their backs, layering sod and clay the way the old Shoshone woman near the river bend had shown him years before, back when he was young enough to ask questions without shame, and she was patient enough to answer them. The neighbors had watched him haul dirt by the wagon load and shook their heads, certain he was building a grave for the both of them, certain no soddy trick from wandering people could outdo good milled lumber and a proper stove. But that first January had proven something quiet and undeniable. Their potatoes had not frozen in the cellar corner. Their well, dug shallow into the bluff's seep, had not iced over the way the town wells had, cracked and useless until March thaw. She recalled a neighbor woman, the miller's wife, stopping by under pretense of borrowing salt, eyes moving over the low, warm room with something like suspicion, as if warmth itself might be a trick played on the unwary. "Feels near stuffy in here," the woman had said, meaning it as complaint, though her own cheeks were chapped raw from the walk over, and her breath still came out in clouds a full minute after she'd stepped inside. Word had traveled, as word does in small places, but it had traveled wrong. Not warm shelter, folks whispered, but warm enough for burrowing creatures, badgers and moles and such, animals that dug instead of building proper. The jest had taken root faster than any respect might have, and by spring the dugout had become the valley's favorite small cruelty, a name flung out at children who misbehaved. Go live like the Whitfields, dig yourself a hole. She had laughed it off then, mostly, because Elias never let the words settle in her the way they might have. Warm and fed, he used to say, stacking wood he didn't yet need. Let them laugh from cold houses. Now, kneeling before a fire that had not gone out in 8 days, working ice from another family's boots, she understood what patience had bought them, and how long a debt could sit unpaid before the valley found itself desperate enough to come collect the answer at their door. A gust rattled the oiled hide over the entrance, and she looked up from the boots to see her husband already rising, head tilted toward the sound outside. Not wind this time, but a knock, heavy and uneven, like a fist that had forgotten how to close properly from the cold. He pulled back the hide, and the lantern light spilled out onto 2 shapes, hunched against the ice, coats crusted white, one leaning on the other like a fence post about to give. She recognized them before they spoke. The taller one had sat at the head of the town council table more times than she could count, always with an opinion about proper building and proper living, always with a glance toward their bluff that suggested pity dressed up as concern. The shorter one had been the loudest, once calling the dugout an insult to decent settlement. Neither man looked capable of insult now. Their beards were sheeted in ice, their eyes rimmed red, and when the taller one opened his mouth to speak, no words came at first, only a shudder that traveled the length of him. "Roof gave," the shorter one finally managed, voice cracked thin. "Both of them, ours and the widow's place next door." Whole ridge beam came down under the ice like it was nothing but kindling. Elias didn't ask what had brought them a mile and a half through the storm to a dugout they'd mocked for years. He simply stepped back and pulled the hide wider, letting the firelight fall full across their faces, and said only, "Come in and get warm." They came in stooped, the way everyone came in, the dugout built low and snug against the bluff, and she watched the taller elder straighten once inside, taking in the packed earth walls, the stone chimney breathing steady heat, the dry floor where a dozen borrowed blankets already lay in careful rows. His mouth opened again, and this time what came out wasn't complaint or apology, but something plainer, quieter. "We tried everything," he said. "Braced the beams, banked the fires higher, put every scrap of wood we owned into keeping the frost off the walls. Nothing held, nothing holds out there anymore." "It's the ground," Elias said, not unkindly, guiding him toward the fire. "Earth doesn't crack the way lumber does. It just gives back what warmth you put into it." The shorter elder lowered himself onto a bench someone had vacated, staring at the fire as though it might explain itself to him, and murmured, half to the room, half to no one, 8 days and this hole in a hillside is the only roof in the valley that hasn't failed us." He said it like a confession, the words dragged out of some place he hadn't visited in years, and she felt her husband go still beside her, the way a man goes still when a debt long owed finally, quietly, begins to be paid. The confession settled into the dugout's warmth like a stone dropped into still water, and she found herself carried backward, the way memory comes uninvited when a room grows quiet enough to hold it. 2 winters passed. Word had already begun to travel. Not through any boast of theirs, but the way news always moved in Larkspur Hollow, mouth to mouth across fence lines and church steps. Someone had noticed their stock fat and steady through a February that killed half the valley's chickens. Someone else remarked that smoke never stopped curling from their chimney, not even during the worst blows, while other homes rationed fuel like it was gold. The talk had reached as far as the mercantile, she was certain, because men who'd never spoken 2 words to Elias began nodding to him on the road, studying him sideways as if trying to work out a puzzle they weren't willing to ask aloud. He'd noticed it too. She remembered him coming in from the barn one evening, stamping snow from his boots, saying nothing for a long while, before he finally spoke what had clearly been sitting on him all day. "Saw the Dunmore boy again. 3rd time this month he's ridden past slow, staring at the bluff like it owes him an explanation." He'd set his gloves down hard enough that she looked up from her mending. Not one of them's asked a single question, not one. She'd tried to soften it. Pride was a heavy thing to carry in a small town, she told him, heavier still for men who'd built their whole lives on doing things the way their fathers had. But he wasn't in a mood to be soothed that night. "I'm not asking them to bow down," he said. "I'm asking them to look at what's working and borrow it before somebody's cattle freeze standing up, before somebody's roof gives out with a family under it." He'd stared into the fire a long moment, jaw working, and then added, quieter, "There's a difference between stubborn and foolish, and I'm watching this whole valley forget where that line sits." She'd said nothing more that night, only reached over and taken his hand, because she understood the weight beneath his frustration, not vanity, but worry, plain and unglamorous, the fear of watching neighbors suffer a hardship that didn't have to be suffered. He wasn't a man who took satisfaction in being right. He only wanted, achingly, for someone to ask. No one had. Not that winter, not the one after. Pride had held the valley's doors shut tighter than any frost, until an ice storm finally did what 2 years of quiet endurance could not. It broke enough will, enough walls, enough certainty, to send men walking half-frozen up a bluff they'd once laughed at, hats in hand, finally ready to ask the question Elias had been waiting years to answer. On the 6th day, the wind did not slacken, and the dugout held 12 bodies pressed close against the earthen walls, breath rising in pale clouds even here, in the one room in the whole hollow that did not bite at exposed skin. Children were not among them. Those families had gone to the church hall days before, but there were mothers who had left their little ones behind to come plead for their husbands, and men whose hands had gone the color of tallow from working frozen fence posts, and one elder who sat nearest the stone wall with his hat still on, as though he might need to leave suddenly, though everyone in the room understood there was nowhere left to go. She saw the fear sitting in them, thick as the cold outside, and she understood that fear left unanswered curdles into something worse, despair, or the kind of stillness that lets a man stop trying. So she rose, and from beneath the shelf where she kept the seed corn and the mending basket, she drew out the old ledger, its pages soft at the corners from years of handling, filled with sketches she had made long ago when he first began banking the earth against the bluff stone. "Come look," she said, and did not wait to see if pride would keep them seated. One by one, they came. She spread the ledger open near the fire's light and traced her finger along the cross-section she had drawn years before. The thick skin of packed soil hugging the stone, the narrow channel of air behind it, the way heat gathered and held, rather than fleeing through thin board walls, the way it did in every frame house, shuddering under the ice outside. "The ground remembers warmth longer than lumber does," she told them. "It doesn't fight the cold, it simply refuses to let it in." She showed them how the stone at their backs drew heat from the small fire and released it slow, through the night, the way a good friend rations comfort so it lasts. She showed them the angle of the bluff, how it turned its face to the winter sun and drank in what little heated light there was, hoarding it in raw earth, the way a thrifty household hoards flour before a hard season. Rough hands turned pages meant only for her own quiet study. Frightened eyes softened into something sturdier, not comfort exactly, but purpose. The particular steadiness of people handed a plan instead of merely a shelter. The elder by the wall leaned forward at last, hat finally coming off, and asked the question 2 winters of silence had refused to let him ask. "Show us how it's built," he said, "all of it, start to end." Naomi began drawing on the back of an old feed ledger, charcoal from the fire pit smudging her fingers, while outside, the wind found new voice and howled against the bluff, like something wanting in. That was the moment Day 7 declared itself, though none of them marked it as such until later, when they counted backward and understood the storm had saved its worst for last. The roof groaned. Not the sharp crack of splitting timber, for there was no timber to split, only the low, shifting complaint of packed earth and sod, settling under a weight of ice thicker than any winter before had thrown at it. Elias moved along the ceiling beams with a lantern, checking the places where root and stone knit together, pressing his palm flat against seams, the way a doctor might test a fevered brow. He found no give. The earth held as it always had, but he watched anyway, because trust was not the same as carelessness. The children, there were 4 now, borrowed blankets making a nest of them near the fire, had stopped crying by midday, worn past fear into a kind of drowsy wonder at the strange warm cave they'd landed in. Their mothers rationed the last of the dried apples into slivers, 1 per palm, and nobody complained of the smallness of it, because smallness shared 12 ways felt different than smallness hoarded alone. Naomi counted the grain sacks twice, and said nothing of what the second count told her, only adjusted the portions a hair smaller and called it plenty. Outside, the ice storm reached for the valley's remaining strength and found little left to take. Inside, something else was building, not warmth alone, though the stone kept its patient work, but the particular closeness of people who had stopped performing politeness and started simply surviving together. An elder who'd once called the dugout a badger hole in open council now split kindling with a boy he'd never spoken 2 words to, and a woman who'd crossed the road rather than pass Naomi's gate stitched a torn coat sleeve by lamplight, murmuring thanks that cost her nothing and meant everything. Elias sat back against the earthen wall, feeling its slow heat through his coat, and watched his wife move among the huddled families, like she'd always known this was the dugout's true purpose. Not merely to shelter 2 people from judgment, but to hold a whole valley's worth of hope until the sky remembered mercy. The wind screamed once more, tested the door, and found it would not yield. Somewhere beneath the noise, Naomi's ledger pages kept filling, line by careful line, a plan for tomorrow drawn in the middle of tonight's worst hour. On the 8th morning, the silence woke them before the light did. It was not the silence of held breath, but of release. No wind clawing the door, no ice ticking against stone. She rose first, pulling her shawl tight, and climbed the earthen steps to push open the door against a brightness so sharp it stung her eyes. Behind her, bodies stirred in the dim warmth, blinking, disbelieving. The sky had gone the pale, scoured blue of a world newly rinsed. They came out slowly, wrapped in borrowed coats and quilts, into a valley transformed and ruined. Ice sheeted every fence post, like glass fingers. The elder who had split kindling the night before stood in the yard and did not speak for a long moment, staring down the slope toward town, where his own roof showed a jagged black gap against the snow. Rafters snapped like kindling. Beyond it, other roofs sagged or had given way entirely. A barn stood roofless, its frame skeletal. Smoke rose from no chimney but the one at their backs. He came to stand beside her in the doorway, and together they looked at what the storm had left standing. The bluff, the packed earth, the stone that had drunk 8 days of cold and given back warmth in return. Whole, unbroken. Not even a shingle out of place, because there had been no shingles to lose. The elder turned to them then, and something in his face had shifted these past days beyond what words could easily carry. "We called this a badger hole," he said, and his voice cracked, not from cold. "We laughed at you across the mercantile counter. Every one of us." He looked at the ruined town, then back at the dugout's low, patient door. "The ground doesn't care what we think of it, only whether we listen." Others murmured agreement, gathering behind him, faces raw with cold and something gentler, shame giving way to gratitude, and gratitude giving way, slowly, to resolve. She felt her husband's hand find hers, rough and warm, and she did not need to look at him to know he was thinking of a Shoshone family's fire pit years gone, of earth banked against stone, of a lesson nearly lost to a valley too proud to ask. "Come spring," he said quietly to the elder, "to all of them, we'll show you how it's done." The elder nodded and did not argue, and that alone said more than any speech the council had ever given. By March, when the ground softened enough to dig, 3 families broke earth along the bluff's gentle curve, measuring angles the way she'd taught them, banking soil the way he had learned long ago from wiser hands than his own. The badger hole had become, at last, a blueprint, proof that the humblest home, built with patience and listening, could outlast any storm the valley dared to send.